Hello, everyone. Depending on what part of the world you're logging in from, a very warm good morning, afternoon, and evening to you all. I'm Vinika Rao, and I'm delighted to have you with us for this very exciting, very topical webinar on global strategies for a post-COVID-19 world. The ramifications of COVID-19 on all aspects of lives and livelihoods across the world continue to manifest. This is a pandemic that has had truly international consequences. No nation has been left unscathed. So how should companies prepare themselves for post-COVID recovery, given that so much has changed? As international trade, investment, and international travel continue to plunge to new lows every day, what are the implications for globalization strategies? Are we witnessing the unraveling of international market connections? Is global value chain integration a thing of the past now? Are there still any advantages for large multinationals vis-à-vis local firms? And overall, how will geopolitical, economic, and social forces shape the global strategies of companies? These are some of the exciting questions that we will be talking to our speakers about. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to our very special speakers for today, Professors Michael Witt and Felipe Monteiro. Michael is Senior Affiliate Professor of Strategy and International Business, and Felipe is Senior Affiliate Professor for Strategy, both at INSEAD. Their extensive experience in teaching and researching these topics make them absolutely ideal to help us understand possible global scenarios and come up with some answers to critical questions. And judging from the questions that you've already been sending us, clearly you agree that this is going to be a very interesting discussion. The format that we'll follow for today's webinar is that I'll first invite each of the professors to give us some opening remarks on the theme of the conversation. I'll also take a few immediate questions for each of the speakers first, and then we'll have them both together for a panel discussion. So send us your questions as they occur to you accordingly. Let me start now with you, Michael. If I could ask you to please share your initial thoughts on post-COVID globalization.
Thank you so much, Vinika, for the kind introduction, and welcome everybody to this webinar. Thanks so much for making time to join us in this discussion. And basically, I have the privilege of starting us out here with some preliminary thoughts on post-COVID global strategy. And I personally really want to emphasize the post-COVID element. We have heard a lot about COVID in the past few months, and obviously for very, very obvious reasons, people and organizations are fighting for their lives. And of course, that is of course the number one priority for everybody. But then at the same time, at some point, maybe hopefully about a year from now, we will enter a period where COVID is no longer as scary, because hopefully we know how to prevent it through a vaccine, or we know better how to treat it. And of course, meanwhile, while the pandemic is going around, certain other developments have not stopped. So what I would like to raise really is the question of what would actually a global strategy look like after we have got this current crisis under control. And allow me perhaps to start out with a poll. And the poll basically is around the question of, once COVID-19 is over, what do you think? I mean, basically, what two business challenges are most likely to keep you as executives awake at night? What is really going to kind of bother you or worry you the most? I have a little poll here, so I will launch the poll right now, okay? And please choose your top two choices, and then we will share with you in a moment. So we have 368 participants right now, 371. Please choose two. Okay, 3, 2, 1, and we have 85%. Let me end the poll here and share the results with you. So what you can see is essentially the winner here would be innovation and disruption. And indeed, that has been a long-standing topic that's been with us for a very, very long time. And next after this comes deglobalization, followed by digitalization, and then sustainability. Interesting enough, diversity, inclusiveness. Not that much something that keeps people awake. And of course, you know, part of keeping you awake is the question of, you know, what should we really expect, and how can we handle that? And here, I fully agree innovation and disruption will continue to be very, very important. That said, however, we actually, of course, have a pretty good idea how what kind of tools we have in order to handle these issues. Okay. So my colleagues in particular also in the strategy area have worked on this for a very, very, very long time. What I personally would like to focus on is your number 2 choice, namely this bit up here, which actually I think should be your number 1 choice, but that's just me, I'm biased, of course. And let me show you basically, why I'm so worried about this. This here is a picture. This is just one indicator of how globalization has been doing. Okay, we started in 1970, and as you can see, nothing much happens for a while. At some point, basically, we see the first upswing. We see some ups and downs. This is related to dot-com bubble bursting, Asian financial crisis, the second financial crisis. But one thing that you will see is that after the second financial crisis, we actually did not recover the previous upward trend. We've been going sideways, and if anything, actually, we have been trending down. And you can say, yeah, that's basically, that's one picture there. Can you basically show us a little bit more than that? I mean, is there something else going on? Do you have any other data? And the answer is, of course, I do. Here is from The Economist in 2019. Basically, what they did is they took a couple of indicators of globalization, and I'm showing you here the ones that are most relevant to economic globalization. There's different parts of globalization, including travel or internet traffic, but really economic globalization. And the upshot here is that indicators have at best stagnated, most have fallen. So it's not just foreign direct investment flows, basically building your presence in other countries. That is no longer something that is happening at levels that we've seen before, but generally speaking, global business as an indicator of globalization, most of these indicators are down. So the question is basically, what's going on here? And of course, basically that question is not raised only by me. You can also see others have reached the same conclusion here. The Economist had this title page a little while back. I think they really took a long time to arrive at this conclusion, but even The Economist now concludes. The important thing here is COVID has accelerated that trend, but it really didn't create that. And you saw that very, very clearly on the first slide I showed you with foreign direct investment over time. The sideways movement and basically the downward trending really started around 2009. So that's not a COVID thing. COVID is a catalyst. It accelerates this whole thing. What's really going on? What is the trigger? And the trigger in short is basically politics. And it actually turns out when we reach outside our usual kind of our tools, our usual theory, we go to political science, we'll actually find that there are theories, there are tools that actually predict globalization, that predict deglobalization. And unfortunately for us, the major tools here all point in the same direction, namely down. I'll give you a very, very kind of very top level summary of what these tools say. The first tool, this is a framework called Liberalism. Those of you who are INSEAD survivors, you know what this means. Otherwise, basically, please, this is just a label. It has nothing to do with outcomes, has nothing to do with left-wing politics, nothing to do with right-wing politics. It's just the name of a theory. And the theory basically says globalization breaks down when countries stop cooperating. And that's often the result of domestic politics. And of course, we've seen that. So, I don't need to say more here, right? But fundamentally here, what we should not forget is that this is partially also a response to economic pain that arrived in the United States, certainly affected blue-collar workers who lost their jobs as a result of globalization and in particular offshoring to China. We have, speaking of China, in China 2025, the idea that basically China should be a world beater in many industries. And of course, that means be self-sufficient. That is not something that actually really speaks in favor of globalization. And of course, many of the partners, trading partners, economic partners have had questions about the tools that are being used in terms of industrial policy. Here, for a different reason, as you know, this is the gentleman who gave us the Brexit or contributed quite a lot to that. And again, this is for different domestic political reasons. A lot of that had to do with basically immigration, unhappiness with immigration in the UK. Now, that's the conventional wisdom. And if the conventional wisdom were basically the only thing to worry about, then we could probably do something about that. About deglobalization, we could turn it around, we could compensate losers from globalization and so on. My worry is that Here, the leading school in political science is actually what explains things best. This is a school that is called Realism, and it fundamentally says globalization breaks down when you don't have a superpower that basically tells people to play. And so here are the rules of the game, basically, and these involve open trade, open investment, and so on and so forth. Once that power is lost, once that superpower can no longer enforce the rules of the game, the whole thing breaks down. You don't need to believe any of those. I'm just telling you these are basically the leading theories. Okay, and let's look at how the hegemon, the superpower, has been doing. Here, this is essentially a picture of the United States in relative decline. This is just one metric. This is GDP at purchasing power parity. And fundamentally what you see is that, of course, China catches up. That's basically what you see here, because the red line is relative to the next largest, and from the early 2000s, that's China. China, by the way, of course, caught up with the United States in 2013 by this metric. And if you want to see basically how the end of hegemony has an impact on how countries deal with each other, here's a reading tip. It's just out in Foreign Affairs. Now, and of course, the main challenge, as I've already said, is China, and I'm not the only one who's saying this. I could perhaps say I've been saying this since 2009. Those of you who were with me in classes back then, essentially back then we did the kind of analyses that lead to these kind of conclusions, and people back then, I think by and large, thought it was kind of cute as an academic exercise. Unfortunately, it's not that much of an exercise anymore. Okay, what's a possible endgame? Possible endgame is basically this split that you see in front of you. And I would like to really emphasize, this is why I have a huge red arrow here. This is a guess. It's not a random guess, but this is my guess. Okay, so if you don't agree with this picture, please, feel free to paint it in different colors. I have not made up my mind on a lot of countries, but fundamentally what I'm saying is blue is likely to be the American camp. Red is likely to be the Chinese camp, and if I have it in lighter red, then obviously it means maybe not that closely connected, a little bit more independent, but still in the same camp. And you could ask, what's this kind of thing in the middle of Europe? That is Switzerland. Switzerland will, of course, forever remain independent. And you're asking what's wrong with India, and basically with India. My view is that India would like to remain independent, basically not align with either, but given recent issues they've had with China, you can guess they will probably be more leaning towards the United States. So this looks green, but it's really kind of yellow for neutral. But my hunch is it will trend with the United States. Now, people say, what about the rest of the world? Okay, for instance, some of my participants from Africa would say you can just paint Africa red. That's their opinion. You may arrive at the same conclusion. Personally, I want to know more about the individual country before I actually make a prediction. Generally speaking, the closer you are to a hegemon, to a very powerful country, the less likely it is for you to be able to get away. And because time is running, allow me to go to your strategic options. I've just actually published an HBR a couple of days ago on this one here. So your strategic options are basically, number one, you decentralize and localize to the point that essentially the people in the other camp don't know that you are from the other camp. Tencent, for instance, has acquired a lot of gaming companies in the West, and nobody knows that. That may be one way of doing that. That said, generally speaking, this is extremely difficult to get to work. Option number two is essentially to run for the hills. And here I have 4 recommendations short term, and I'm not saying do it, I'm saying get ready. And one of them is that, of course, Hong Kong is effectively over, at least as a safe haven that it used to be. You have all followed the security law that is being introduced. Essentially, it means that the principle of one country, two systems has been pierced. How credible the rule of law in Hong Kong still is a really, really important question. I wouldn't bet too much on it. Moving supply chains, okay, to safe places while you have time. Safe place is usually not the guy next door to a hegemon. So if you're Chinese, you don't want to move your supply chain, if you have one in the US, to Mexico. If you're American, I'm not really sure Vietnam is the greatest choice, because I'm not really sure how easy it will be for Vietnam to stay out of the sphere of influence for China. reevaluate relationships with Chinese companies and universities. And I give you here one link. The Australians have actually put together a nice kind of tool where you can see what universities have, what kind of military ties in China. And you'd be surprised, it's a very, very long list. So essentially, just be very careful. And lastly, I would actually recommend to factor in investment risk. And of course, not only the risk of losing your money, but actually at some point you may face the question of, well, we're in the midst of something like a Cold War. Why are you actually investing in the other side and contributing to their economic power? And you can say that's not what we learned to think at INSEAD or in an MBA. That's absolutely correct. That, however, is politics. It's about power. All right, for more details, you can Google Michael Witt, INSEAD HBR. I have 2 articles on exactly that. The last one just came out 4 days ago. I should stop here and basically turn things over, right? So let me just say for now, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for listening, and we'd be happy to discuss your questions.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for setting the stage. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for setting the stage on the macro trends around this whole issue. Quick question to you before we move ahead. Before we talk about what might come and trends to come, let's take a look back at history. Is there, I wonder, any historical precedent for this kind of deglobalization? Has this happened before? And if yes, what was the response of companies at that time? Are there any lessons that we can learn from history?
That's a really great question. Thank you, Vinika. And basically, of course, people actually often feel that globalization is something that is new, something also that is unstoppable. And of course, that's not the case. When we go back in history, in particular over the past 200 years, you will actually not find any economic historian who would argue that globalization is new. What they argue about is whether we are now at the end of the second wave of globalization or the third wave of globalization, right? But essentially, they would say at least one wave of globalization has stopped before, and of course, that was in the 1930s. And during this time, essentially what we saw is actually also consistent again with realism, as it turns out, and liberalism. What we saw is there was no hegemon around. The previous hegemon was the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom stopped being the world hegemon in 1914. It took them until 1956 to figure that out, but fundamentally stopped being the world hegemon in 1914. And at that point, it actually meant nobody was there anymore to enforce the rules of the game. And we saw the whole thing coming down during the 1930s. Now, in my classes, sometimes people say it's like, the reason for globalization breaking down back then was war. And obviously that's not correct, right? Because the war started actually after globalization had already started to break down. What did companies do? Very much the same as what we've just talked about. Some of them withdrew. Others tried to localize. And there's fascinating economic history and business history on this, what they did. And basically, in some cases, they actually even severed the ownership ties to the subsidiaries and asked other people, good friends, people who they thought were good friends, to hold their subsidiaries in trust so that they would not be confiscated as enemy assets. Unfortunately, the people they thought they could trust quite often were not that trustworthy. So a lot of this property actually in the end got stolen. In the end, it actually turns out much of the localization strategy was tried, didn't work particularly well. At the latest, when really the enmity reaches a high level, usually what happens is your assets are confiscated, and that's the end of that story.
Very interesting, thank you. So it has happened before, and so there are lessons to be learned. Indeed. So one more question to you before I invite Felipe into the conversation. Now, even before you actually presented, we already had lots of questions on the US and China. You touched upon it and the whole issue of hegemons. And perhaps because there's a lot of interest in the role of geopolitics and international shifts, there are questions around, and they want you to elaborate a little bit. Our audience would like you to elaborate a little bit about what's happening between US and China. Does this mean that we're heading to a world which will be divided between these two big powers? And interestingly, will it be impossible for countries to play both sides?
Okay. I think I've pretty much answered the question about will the world be divided. I think the chances are pretty high. Is this an outcome that I'm looking forward to? No, right? But again, this is basically something that would be predicted by theory. And to a certain extent, we're seeing that right now. before our very eyes, right? Every day when we read the news, fundamentally, we see that new restrictions, especially on the American side, are coming into effect. Can countries play both sides? It basically depends a little bit. If you're, I think the most likely candidates for that would either be very large or very small players. Yeah. But generally speaking, yes, some of them may actually be able to do that. I think Russia in principle could actually do that, play off the West against China. The risk, of course, at some point is that you slip up and essentially, you know, you lose that independence. I think Singapore, to a certain extent, will want to try to actually not tie itself too closely to one side. At least that's what I thought until recently, until I found out, I think 2 days ago, that Singapore had just decided that the 5G network here would not include Huawei. So maybe Singapore has made its choice. I'm not entirely sure, but usually a small country could always argue, we're insignificant, don't worry too much about us. We can be useful to both sides. I think those would be configurations that could actually help that strategy.
Wonderful, thank you. Let me now invite Felipe into the conversation to give his opening remarks on the webinar theme, and then we'll bring Michael back and continue to address questions to both of them. Felipe, over to you.
Thank you, Vinica. Good morning for those of us here in Europe. A very good morning, early good morning for those of you calling from Americas. Good afternoon, good evening for those of you in Asia. So what I'd like to do is offer complementary view to what Michael has just done. And you're being patiently quiet there. So let me start with another poll. So let me go here and ask you, let me launch here the poll and ask you whether do you think that we've seen the end of globalization? So can you just, do you agree with this statement? Do you think we are seeing the end of globalization? Okay, we have 400 answers. Let me show you the results. So what you see here is 3/4 of you believe that we're not seeing the end of globalization. So 1/4 of you, about 100 people believe we've seen the end. What I will do is I'll show you another slide and I'll go another poll, and then I will make comments about why I asked you those two questions. So the next question is this one. Let me launch a new poll. And so let me go here and ask you, some of you may have read this book, Thomas Friedman at certain point saying, no, the world is flat. And you can even see what he was saying, looking back when he wrote the book. Do you agree with him? Do you think that the world is flat? So please go again and just say yes or no to what extent you agree with Thomas Friedman. And what you see here is a little bit more divided. Still, most people don't agree with the statement, but for 40% of you, you believe the world is flat. I think the reason, let me stop sharing the results. The reason I ask those two questions is, and I typically tell my students here at INSEAD provocatively, saying that if you said yes to either question, probably you should not care about global strategies. Because if you think that it's the end of globalization, what it probably means is that you have to have one strategy per country. So you have to incur very high costs of localizing for each country where you are. On the other hand, if you go to the other extreme and you think that the world is flat, okay, also you don't need a global strategy, you probably have one strategy and you're gonna deploy it globally because they are the same, right? The world is flat. As you can gather, I am like most of you, I don't agree with either statement. And what I believe, and I'll try to provide you some data, which is very complementary and to a large extent in line with what Michael was describing, is that what you see is more of a pendulum, right? So it will be naive to believe that globalization has always been increasing and it's gonna be inevitable like Thomas Friedman was saying. I think also maybe too pessimistic if you say, no, this is the end, we're over. Now, each country you go, you have to do a different thing. And what I think is important, I'll provide you 3 quick statements and then try to zoom in on what's the implication for different industries. I think the first one is the idea that globalization is partial. And some of you might be familiar with this. So DHL, they publish a report they call the DHL Connectedness Index. And in that report, and the latest one was in 2018, what they mentioned is they just try to see the share of global and of international operations of flows vis-a-vis local flows. And what you see is kind of a number of dimensions, from world output to population to university students to stock market. It's still, the world is very local. So it will be probably undue to believe that at any point the world has been so globalized that most flows were international flows. It's still, the world is very local. So there's still a lot of things that can be, a lot of flows that can increase in terms of international flows. So I think it's important to realize that even before COVID, most of the flows were local, not global. Second point here is what Michael described. And I think Vinica's question to him saying, have we seen those blips and have we seen those kind of moments where he had a big push for deglobalization? And I'm using the same source here with a little kind of broader time line that Michael had when he showed you the data from The Economist. So here's from 2001 to 2018, and you will see moments, right? And they try to combine different ways of capturing globalization or connectedness, different types of flows. And you see moments that it was growing, then coming down after the 2008 crisis, and then kind of going up again, and then coming down. And this is all pre-COVID. I think the realization to me when I see this is just acknowledging, right, and taking into account that we will see a decrease in globalization following COVID. I'm not sure how deep it will be, and I'm not sure for how long it's going to take. But what I'm pretty convinced is it will not be unprecedented, right? And we are likely to see sooner or later some kind of re-globalization coming. And I think my final point, and maybe this is in a different line, I mean, not a different meaning opposing, but different in terms of a specific focus to what Michael was describing before, is trying to zoom in on, can we see how globalization affects industries differently? So not all industries might be affected in the same way. And what I'd like to offer you is a very simple framework that we normally use in some of our sessions here at INSEAD, which is, if you think about what pressures an industry to be more or less globally integrated, we can think about 4 types of drivers. You can ask yourself, to what extent my consumers have similar tastes and needs? To what extent I'm serving the same consumers worldwide? To what extent I have global branding? So these are kind of set of market drivers. Then we can go, and to me, what is clear here is a lot of what we see now is the impact of government drivers in terms of to what extent industries are being more or less pressured to be globally integrated. So clearly, even in industries like the government many times didn't interfere, I think what we're seeing now, and a lot of it as a result of the forces that Michael was describing, is seeing more pressure for localization due to government drivers. But I think what is also true is it is not everything, right? Government drivers is not the only type of drivers. So if on the one hand, we'll see more push for localization as it comes to government, as we look in terms of competition, as we look in terms of cost drivers, my assessment is we will continue to have a lot of pressure for those industries, for a number of industries to be very global, especially as you think about digital and digital transformation. So it was very interesting in in Michael's first poll, he was asking you what will keep you awake after COVID. And I think most of you will talk about innovation and disruption. My assessment is that innovation and disruption are likely to push a lot of industries to be even more global, more globally integrated. And they will have to find a way of dealing with all those other forces that Michael was describing, which here in this framework is describing in terms of government drivers. So if I were to summarize here, and maybe I need to go and let me go here and erase this thing here so we don't need this anymore. I think we are experiencing this and we'll continue to experience a lot of pressure for local adaptation coming from government drivers. If you go, let's go to pharma, right? And we see what's happening in many different parts of the world of kind of government asking companies to fulfill local needs, to localize production. So if this is true from government drivers, if you still stay in the same industry, pharma, you know that for you to come up with a new blockbuster, you really need to do this at a global level. I mean, it is not economically viable for you to produce new drugs locally, right? And localize in terms of R&D. So what we are likely to see is kind of government drivers pushing you to be more local on a number of dimensions, but also many pressures for a number of industries to be globally integrated when it comes to market, cost, competitive drivers, especially in the digital world. So maybe what we do in here, and what I would encourage you to think, is just to take into account a number of forces. So obviously, as you read kind of the press and newspapers and headlines, and right, and Michael and I were showing you the cover of The Economist and others, sometimes we see certain pressures really strong. I would encourage you to see kind of a broader picture of different pressures, and also to be familiar with this idea that maybe you have this pendulum where you see things going in one direction and then coming back sooner or later. Vinik, I think what I will do is I'll stop now, and maybe you have some questions, and then we.
Indeed. Thank you, Felipe. Thank you for a more nuanced look into the pressures that could drive specific industries to be more or less global, among other things. And in fact, if I remember correctly, your very last slide, the last sentence spoke about the pressures towards globalization, towards keeping more globally integrated in a digital world. And I think that's really something quite critical, and a lot of questions coming in about the impact of technology and digitalization on globalization. So I was wondering if we could discuss this in your case with some specific example that you're very familiar with. And now I know you have a case on Tag Heuer and how they have had a global partnership with Intel and Google, where I think it really exemplifies how technology drives this integration, cooperation between geographical clusters. So if you could give us some insights from that case study, that'll make the conversation more interesting.
Thank you, Vinik. Let me go here to my slides. I did write a case on Tag Heuer, the watch company. And to me, what was interesting in that story, and it is very timely, you may see this on the newspapers. Very recently, there was this conversation on how the smartwatches disrupting the Swiss watch industry. You may also have seen, this is from last month, about a month ago, there was this article at the How to Spend magazine at the FT talking about the new Tag Heuer watch. And some of you who might be familiar with this family name, Arnaud, this is the son of Bernard Arnault, and he's now he's the CEO of Tag Heuer. And the story there, Vinika, is how an industry which was really local in terms of production, most of the Swiss watch industry, right, is really in that Swiss watch cluster. If they want to embark on the connected watches and on the connected devices technology, they really had to reach out to a completely different cluster, which is kind of Silicon Valley and what's happening now, and then your reference to the partnership with Google and Intel. So I think what caught my attention in that case was really this idea that even clusters which seem to be the leaders in their industries, how technology and how digital might force them to reach out and to go to other places. And I also, in addition to the case, I also published this article in our INSEAD magazine, because I think the story there can be both in terms of what Switzerland is learning from Silicon Valley, but also I think there's a lot that Silicon Valley can learn from Switzerland and from kind of luxury. So I think this is an interesting development in terms of how technology might be pushing even very local clusters, very kind of leaders to be reaching out and globalizing.
Great. So that's a very interesting example of this sort of how technology created integration between Silicon Valley and Switzerland. If we can move now from the Silicon Valley of technology to what I think I've seen you describe as the Silicon Valley of football. There you have another recent case, which will be quite interesting in this conversation around technology and digitalization. Your case on FC Barcelona and how they have responded to the COVID-19 crisis through this massive digitalization effort. Can you talk us through that? What are some interesting learnings that we might be able to share with the audience based on that case?
Oh, I believe a lot of people here might know this club. This is one of the most successful football clubs in the world. And I think what is interesting that's happening now, Vinica, is for those of us who are fans of football, you cannot go to the stadium anymore. And right, you may not be able to see this gentleman playing live. But what's I think Barcelona is doing, and it's very interesting what happened to them after COVID, is how can they really embrace digitalization and innovation, really to globalize the club. So if you look at the members of FC Barcelona, most of them are Catalans. But if you look really in terms of the fans, there's really kind of global fans all over the world. And I will just show you a few images, and happy to go back to this if people have more questions later. But basically what's happening now is how FC Barcelona end up really engaging on digital to keep the connection with the fans. So somehow it's interesting because I think it is the flows of people and the ability of people to go to the stadiums is really limited. On the other hand, what you have seen is really how the technology has allowed them, has really enabled FC Barcelona to connect to the fans globally. And they recently launched the Barca TV, etc. So I'll stop sharing here, but maybe the crux of the idea here is, despite all the challenges we're facing, and we'll continue to face after COVID, I think what's interesting is how digital is really pressing a lot of those companies to find new solutions to keep their global engagement. And I think this might be something that we'll continue to see in the future. So I'll stop and
thank you. Michael, bringing you back into the conversation now. So, Felipe's spoken about these two specific cases, the impact of technology with reference to these organizations. So if we could get your views on technology and deglobalization in a more macro sense. We have questions coming in about, won't technology keep globalization alive? And how can deglobalization and the growth of a global tech sector happen simultaneously?
Sure. Thanks, Vinica. In general, and again, we can look at precedent before, right? Basically, technology is something that permits for globalization to happen. It basically makes it easier to run business abroad. Transportation costs fall because of advances in technology. Communication costs fall because of advances in technology. It's easier to coordinate things across boundaries. So basically, advances in technology are and have always been basically something that pushes globalization upwards. However, we again know, because we have seen deglobalization before, what basically determines whether we make use of those opportunities or whether we don't is a question of politics, right? So essentially here, you can say, technology in principle enables it, but whether politics allows it, that is the really, really big question. And effectively, think about it. I mean, globalization, when you talk about tech, none of those big tech companies, certainly none, so you talk about Facebook, Google, and so on and so forth, none of those are doing anything in China. Because China at some point basically decided to kick them out. It's like either you play by our rules or you leave. And essentially China has decided to get foreign players also out of its IT stack, which means, if you're, for instance, Ericsson or any of the providers, you're not going to be selling any 5G equipment in China, period. Right? And at this particular point, And what the United States is doing is effectively the opposite, namely saying, okay, well, Huawei, then you're not selling any equipment in the United States, and let me lean on my allies not to buy anything from Huawei either. Okay. So the upshot of the whole thing is sure, technology is a driver of globalization, but we have somebody at the helm who can basically decide whether we turn it on or whether we turn it off. What we're seeing is that basically we're getting more and more of these switches turned off. And somebody asked, you know, well, aren't you going to get globalization, but then more in those two spheres that you described? And it's like, that's no longer globalization. I get the point, right? But fundamentally, what you're going to get is regionalization. So we still get some of the benefits of trade and so on and so forth, but it will be within those regions rather than across. Think about it. Already America is not letting, for instance, Chinese students come back. So we have all these restrictions. Basically, you just need to keep an eye open. You will see, essentially, we're really tightening up quite a lot.
Felipe, just continuing on, you know, the whole idea of digital businesses, an interesting set of questions on the opportunities for smaller digital businesses. Given that, you know, we spoke about some of the larger companies and the challenges that they have, as Michael was saying. So given the complexity of challenges to global supply chains for these larger tech companies, what are the opportunities that might exist then for smaller digital companies? Is this, you know, where they come into their fore then?
I think what's interesting when we think about small digital companies is that in the digital world, the entry costs of the cost of internationalizing are much lower than in the brick and mortar world. Because you can imagine, right? If you are really a brick and mortar company, for you to start operating globally, and if that entails creating a new factory, hiring people there, et cetera, is a huge cost. For a number of digital businesses, that cost of operating abroad doesn't require all that investment. So I think it opens up a lot of opportunities for smaller companies to globalize without having that high entry costs. And I think what's interesting, I'd like to kind of continue the conversation with Michael somehow, is one way to look at this kind of innovation, globalization, digitalization, technology is really the companies which are really the providers of technology, right? And you can think, you talk about Huawei, and you can think about, right, all the tech companies in the US. The other thing would be the users of technology. So I was wondering, Michael, to what extent do you think, if I am a user, okay, if I am, right, for the sake of the argument, kind of FC Barcelona, can I use kind of Chinese and American compatible technologies to kind of allow me to do my global strategy? Can I go to China, and in China, I'm using the Chinese ecosystem, right? Tencent and WeChat. And then I go to the US and I use WhatsApp and Facebook. So to what extent do you see the users, companies as users, not as the providers, being able to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a good point. Namely, in principle, if you talk about something like soccer, I mean, soccer is basically not really particularly, shall we say, of great military significance, even though we've actually had a war in South America before that was called the Soccer War, but let's not go there. Generally speaking, I mean, there's trade in certain things that is harmless, right? And of course, if you're, let's say, if you're basically Barca, you know, then you can go ahead and fundamentally stream to both sides. Of course, what it means is you actually, again, you know, to a certain extent regionalizing, because you have one set of infrastructure here, you have another set of infrastructure here. So effectively, you're not getting the benefit that you would be getting of a truly globalized market where one platform would actually do it for you. Then it gets interesting, right? Because increasingly we actually see that even sports clubs basically get torn in between. Think about it, right? I mean, basically, you know, so Barcelona, what are you going to say about Hong Kong? Are you going to support basically the people who essentially are against the Chinese security law, or are you going to support this, the protesters, or are you not? We've seen with the NBA basically what happens if only one speaker says the wrong thing. On the other hand, if you don't say anything, at some point your own audiences will go after you and say, why are you not defending the freedoms that you're enjoying in your own country? And I think many companies will very quickly realize that basically this is something that is very, very difficult to do, because you come across as bigoted.
I think just a quick follow-up on this. I think what's fascinating, Michael, is how digital also pushes companies to a level of global disclosure, right, or global pressure in social media, because I've been highlighting the positive side of technology. I can go and reach my fans worldwide. I think what you bring into that story is true, but also you may have those pressures from kind of fans and social media in different places, which will require, and if the geopolitical tensions are that high, what kind of positioning you may have to have and the implications. So yeah, very interesting.
So I actually think, not even something as innocuous as soccer is actually safe. At a minimum, people should think about it, right? What do you do if one of your players basically says, I support freedom for the Uyghurs in China? And see basically, what are you going to do then, right? At a minimum, you need to think about that.
Okay.
Vinika, any other difficult questions for us?
Yes, I am now going to take you in a completely different direction. So Felipe, you're the academic director of INSEAD's Global Talent Competitiveness Index, and we have some questions around talent. So what are the implications of deglobalization, if that's the way we're going, on talent? If I can ask you to comment first, Felipe.
Yeah. Very good question, Vinika. And actually, I think what we're seeing recently shows, first it shows, so what I'm referring to is kind of Trump's kind of ban on a number of visas, including for high-skilled workers. I mean, what we know from our report, Vinika, is that countries which are on the top are always countries which are very open to kind of top talent in the world. Okay, so typically Switzerland has been number one. This year, the US became number two. Singapore's number three. Last year was number two. And those countries typically, they have been very open to the flow of talent. So I think if we see something like big restrictions like we experience in the US now for top talent, I think this will negatively impact the competitiveness of those countries. So I think that's number one. At the same time, I think what's interesting, right? And I'm calling, so for the audience, welcome to my home. I'm here in Fontainebleau in France. So here in France, what we have seen, we kind of know if either of you is following, is also the French reaction immediately to highlight. France has what they call the French tech visa, right? And which is really trying to bring a lot of entrepreneurs and high-skilled labor to France. So if on the one hand, we may see movements like the US and what Trump is doing, saying restricting talent, and this is bad for the competitiveness of the US, and I would say to kind of competitiveness of the global economy, more broadly speaking. I think on the other hand, may open opportunities for countries like France. Say, okay, yes, you're not interested in that talent. I'm definitely am. And right, and obviously Canada would benefit from that too. So quickly summarizing, what we know from the report is kind of openness to high-skilled labor is really critical for talent competitiveness. I think what we experience in the US goes against that. Number three, other countries may take advantage of that and really try to attract labor and really high-skilled labor.
And continuing with another, very important theme and different from what we've discussed so far, Michael, perhaps to you, is a more localized world a more sustainable one? Is there hope from that point of view?
I would answer this as I'm not sure it is, and for a very, very simple reason. I think instinctively it makes sense that, shall we say, apples that are grown 400 kilometers away from you should actually be, for instance, more sustainable than apples that are grown, let's say from a European perspective, apples that are grown in South America. As it turns out, you can actually be pretty wrong about that, because if you look at the entire life cycle of that apple, the transportation cost of getting this thing from South America to Europe may actually not be something that has a major impact on this whole thing. So the upshot of is that making the distances shorter, yes, you could say that it could actually contribute to sustainability, for instance, by decreasing emissions from transportation. However, if then at the same time producing this particular product is actually more energy intensive than wherever else it would have been produced, then basically you're not really gaining much. We also have to consider that globalization basically has enabled companies, we call this, to fine slice basically their supply chain. In other words, try to put basically whatever activities they have in the best possible location. Right? Now, of course, you never get the best possible, but fundamentally you can optimize the supply chain and basically do the right stuff somewhere where things are good. So you would, for instance, not do the aluminum back in your backyard, right? You would do the aluminum where there's a lot of water power, so that you can actually then make good use of that. And again, that would contribute to sustainability. Now, if we regionalize, it's possible we may actually lose some of these opportunities, some of these possibilities. So I would say the jury is out on whether actually a deglobalized world is a more sustainable world. I think the connection is not as straightforward as it would seem initially.
Felipe, anything you'd like to add to that?
I would say, that if we think about sustainability also in terms of having innovative, sustainable solutions, think about renewable energy. I think the solutions, really the technology that will enable those solutions, they really require kind of some global cooperation. They also require kind of some global development. So I think it's very difficult for a totally local player to be able to come with those innovative solutions. So I think a more localized world in terms of innovation is likely to be a less sustainable world. I think, the ideal scenario in this context to me would be still being able to develop kind of global solutions and then applying them kind of to local contexts. But yeah, so if I think about who are the global leaders in terms of sustainable solutions, I would say these are really companies who are trying to do this at a global level.
Indeed. Okay, so Michael, one of the things that we tell ourselves as we grapple with the pandemic is that this too shall pass. Right. So if I can ask you, when do you see this whole anti-globalization trend passing? How and when will we get back to a world that focuses on globalization? Will that happen? And if yes, when do you think that'll happen?
Nice question. And luckily, actually, theory gives us some guidance to this. So I'll start with realism. If it's really true that you need a hegemon in order to have globalization, right, then the answer is you're going to get globalization when you have a new hegemon. Right? This could be America basically, rediscovers its magic and somehow re-emerges as the world's hegemon. That would require, I think, a lot of changes in the United States. But anyway, it's possible. The other possibility is that China or another player becomes the world hegemon and basically puts a new kind of set of rules in place for the entire system. I already mentioned China, most likely candidate. India, long shot. In principle, large enough to actually play that role. In practice, needs to stop shooting itself in the foot on its journey to economic development. And then sometimes people say, how about the European Union? And basically my answer is that would require a true miracle. But anyway, once you have a new hegemon, you probably have globalization again. If you believe more in liberalism, then essentially the question will become, how can you actually turn the mood around in various kind of countries, in particular big ones? And again, the United States would be absolutely crucial here. And America needs to discover basically a way to compensate the losers from globalization. It cannot be that you close a factory overnight, basically make everybody redundant and say, we don't owe you a thing because we've paid you the wages so far. Now farewell. That doesn't work. We're basically getting essentially the answer, and the answer is Trump. And anyway, we need to move beyond that.
Okay. So we're in the last few minutes of this webinar. I think what I'd like to do now is to ask each of you to perhaps give us your closing remarks, your closing thoughts, some words of advice for our audience. We have people from all over the world and lots of questions around implications for different countries. You touched upon some of them. There's some specific questions around Singapore, Taiwan, Africa, Latin America, the EU, the implications of the coming elections in the US and what a democratic victory might mean. Some very, very interesting questions, which we don't have time to go through now. So if I can ask you each to just share your closing words of advice with our audience on the theme of on how perhaps they can look at deglobalization or globalization and the implications for their companies.
Felipe, I started the presentation. How about you go first here?
So let me finish with this image. So most of you will recognize I'm talking about the Louvre here in Paris. And to me, the challenge here is similar to the challenge we see in this picture, is how do you combine to some extent, the old with the new, right? The global with the local. And I think the beauty of this image is to see that's not one replacing the other, but is the combination. And I think that combination is really tricky. It's not easy at all. And I think Michael enumerated many reasons why it can be tricky. But my encouragement to you, especially for those of you who have been here to this school, is that we find good ways, right, of building that kind of new reality in combination with our heritage, right, and this ability to do both. So these are my final remarks. And I know that a lot of people today is kind of people who have been here. I look forward to welcome you back here. And it was really nice to have this conversation.
Okay. And my closing words would basically be to say, it looks like on the surface that effectively we've actually argued that globalization is at an end, and basically it means also an end for global strategy. I do believe that we're going to take a break from globalization, right? And I've already said in response to Vinika's question, what it would actually take for this one to basically get into round 3 or round 4, depending on what you're counting for the ways of globalization is. However, global strategy is not finished. As a matter of fact, I would actually encourage you very strongly to redouble your efforts in terms of understanding and mastering global strategy for a very simple reason. When things basically in the 2000s, during the heyday of globalization, actually things were relatively straightforward. You had to internationalize, and fundamentally you had free choice. You could pretty much go wherever you wanted, and you could find slice that supply chain. You could actually go to that market and probably even be successful. However, now things are becoming more complicated. The benefits to companies of internationalization are still all there, but the playing field has become a lot more complicated. So if anything, actually, the irony is that deglobalization actually means that global strategy has become even more important. This is really now the day and age when skills matter. It's not enough to just say we're going to open somewhere. Thank you.
Global strategy is not finished. It's just more complicated now. Very insightful ending words, I think, to close this webinar with. A big round of thanks now to Felipe and Michael, both of you, for some great insights. And also thank you to our audience for some excellent questions. I want to tell you a recording of this session will be available and we'll send it across to you. So if there's anything you want to revisit, that can certainly be done. Or if you want to share it with anyone else, do feel free to do that, and continue to stay engaged with us at INSEAD's Lifelong Learning, some other exciting webinars for you to follow. Big thank you for being with us today. Have a great rest of the day.